Hello, John Feldt here. This is the Blue Water Outlook briefing for the Southeast U.S. on April 7th, 2013. Well, you know, last week was not one of my better forecasts for the Southeast U.S. I expected this heavier rain over Texas and Oklahoma here, which did occur, to move further off to the east. And there was some rain over the Southeast U.S. You can see the areas in green were an inch or two, a couple pockets of around 2 inches. So it wasn't a total miss, but definitely I expected more rain along the southern parts of Alabama, southern parts of Mississippi. And I'll explain sort of what happened to that in just a bit. This is the percent of normal for last week. Blues are above normal, reds are below normal. Something else I want to mention here as we go through this briefing is that for the last couple weeks, when we start seeing the areas of blue and red next to each other, the precipitation patterns are becoming more scattered. Now, if you look in the Midwest here, in the area of red, that's very clear as far as dry, as well as the Southwest U.S. If you look at Oklahoma, that's pretty wet. But we're getting a mixed bag over the Southeast U.S. And when you get that, it's sort of hard to call a trend one way or the other. It might be more status quo, but it is being a lot more mixed. And some of the more recent rainfall trends that have been positive look like they're really not continuing in a very direct manner at this time. So I wanted to go back about 90 days. Give you an indication of the percent of normal. And 90 days ago, you can see Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia received well above normal rainfall for that average, and that came earlier in the period. Carolinas have been quite a bit drier over the last 90 days, and Florida's been very dry. But if we go in closer to a 30-day average, look at this here. We see some changes. We see drier patterns over the southern part of Alabama and Mississippi. And we still see that trend over the northern parts of those states. But what this shows is that the earlier recharge over southern parts of Alabama and Mississippi really have not continued over the recent past, the last 30 days. Over the northern parts of those states, it appears that it has, perhaps not quite as strong. And over the Carolinas, both in the near term and in the longer term, we've seen that drier pattern, especially with areas compared to areas further off to the west. So if we look at the drought outlook, there has been very significant improvement since November. The drought monitor from November 20th is on the left, and the latest one is on the right. And you can see that much of the drought has pretty much gone over the Southeast U.S., with the exception of very small areas of relatively minor drought over Georgia and the Carolinas. Now, Florida is a little bit more the opposite. I just showed you how dry it's been over the last 90 days, and you can see drought is expanding over Florida. Now, I think a key here on the April 2nd drought monitor is, and I'm going to mention this, I'm going to talk about this quite a bit in this briefing, is that I really would have liked to have seen this drought totally extinguished. And you might look at that and you might say, okay, well, it hasn't it? Well, yes and no. It's been a very significant improvement. Reservoir levels, especially Lake Lanier, have really seen a very significant recharge. There have been a lot of other improvements, but still I think there's some hesitancy for me to say that everything's over, and I'll show you why in just a minute. Okay, so if we look at the soil moisture anomalies, what we see here are areas of dry conditions over the middle part of the nation and wet conditions over the Southeast U.S. And this is sort of interesting to see that when we look at the whole nation, really the area that has seen the most improvement in the recent past, the last several months, has been the Southeast U.S. So while we have received very welcome rain that's made drought improvement possible, on the other hand, the Midwest and Great Plains and the Southwest U.S. continue with very significant drought conditions in those regions. But it's a little bit more complicated, and I wanted to sort of express that, showing both short and long-term drought indicator blends. Now, short-term drought indicator blends are based on parameters that are indicated here sort of at the bottom, but this is the shorter month weights, the 1 or the 3 month precipitation, the soil moisture, upper soil moisture, and that shows that conditions are in either normal or pretty good shape over most of the Southeast U.S., with the exception of North Carolina, that even from a short-term perspective is not in the best shape. But if you looked at that alone from a short-term perspective, you'd say almost all this area here is in pretty good shape. And that is correct if you're looking at parameters that respond to short-term soil moisture. short-term indicators such as most stream flow and upper soil moisture. But if we go to longer-term parameters, there's a little bit different picture. You really don't see the long-term improvement over Georgia and definitely over the Carolinas. So what I'm trying to sort of bring together here is both from a long and short-term perspective, you see improvements over most of Alabama and Mississippi. And I think in those regions, there has definitely been an improvement back to normal. But because of Georgia and South Carolina have not really improved upon, they have improved upon, but they still are lingering impacts due to long-term parameters, I think there's still that concern that the drought could expand fairly quickly if we don't get more rain. As we get into the eastern part of the Carolinas, both from a short and long-term perspective, just really haven't received as much rain, and there's even more concern in those areas that the drought could expand once again. Okay, so back to the current picture. The Arctic Oscillation is forecast to get back up to a neutral condition very soon, towards the middle of the month. We were looking at this record low. I mentioned it's going to get back up towards positive, but what it did, it took a quick little dip here over the last week, and now it's coming back up again. And that quick little dip there did sort of complicate the forecast, delayed it a little bit. And I wanted to explain that. This is the big picture. This is an image I showed last week, and I was forecasting this split jet stream. This is the northerly branch, southerly branch, and I thought the Southeast U.S. would be in the southerly branch, which would be more active. Heavy rain would be in the area in the dashed line. And generally, that was the case. That area did receive some significant rain, just not as much as was forecast. Reason was that we really never got into that true split flow pattern. We were more in a west to east zonal flow, and there wasn't as much energy on the southerly branch. Now this week, a little bit different situation, still similar to that transition to a positive AO, but what we have here in blue is early this week, and we have the jet stream off to the west. This is an area of energy that will be pulling out to the east, and it looks like it's going to break off into two pockets of energy, one moving up to the northeast into the Midwest, one moving into the southern and southeast U.S., that's this one right here, and that's the one that will be affecting us as that pushes off into the southeast U.S. early this week. Now right now it looks like the northerly pulse of energy will be much stronger than the southerly pulse, and consequently rain that develops out to the west will be diminishing as it pushes off to the east. So this is the rainfall forecast, and snow actually north of that white line. But you can see, once again, we have areas of rain developing over Oklahoma and Texas, East Texas, pushing off to the east and significantly diminishing as we move from Mississippi into Alabama, into Georgia, into the Carolinas. So it looks like this week, once again, areas that have been fairly wet will remain fairly wet. Areas that have been dry will remain drier, become drier. And then sort of in the middle, again, that mixed picture in the middle. Now, I wanted to look a little bit further as we went out towards the end of April, mid to end of April. These are climate model precipitation forecasts, and it shows on the top panel week 1 and the bottom panel week 2. Top panel does show a hint of that rain that pushes over the area this week. But in the second week, week 2, as we get that west to east flow, that's typically can be a fairly quiet pattern. It can be mild as far as temperatures go, but also quiet, and that is what the models are forecasting, a quiet, very strong, dry pattern over the southeast U.S. during week 2. Consequently, as we go for the next 2 weeks, soil moisture change, it looks like the area of heaviest rain for week 1 is giving us generally a slight positive or improvement or an increase in soil moisture over Mississippi and Alabama. Everywhere else, it looks like continuing decrease in soil moisture in this region for the next 2 weeks for the average. So the takeaway points from this week's briefing: it looks like this week pulse of energy will be pushing through. We'll be on the southern tier of this energy, which will be weakening as it moves off to the east. We will develop a positive Arctic oscillation and a zonal flow pattern, and with that, it looks like the action could be shifting to the north. So after this week's bout of rain, it looks like we could be going into a fairly quiet and dry spell as we head into the latter part of April. Thank you for listening to this briefing. I will be updating this again next Sunday.